This is BBC News. I'm Regid Ahmed. Our top stories. President Trump has been meeting with emergency workers and victims of California's worst ever wildfires. More than 70 people have died in the blaze. More than 250,000 people have joined protests across France in anger at rising fuel prices. Hello and welcome to BBC News. President Trump is in California to see the damage caused by the US state's worst ever wildfires. Visiting the town of Paradise, which was largely destroyed, Mr. Trump said everybody had done incredible work to respond to the disaster. He also revisited his claim that poor forest management was to blame. More than 70 people have died and about 1,000 are still unaccounted for. Dan Johnson has this report from Paradise.
In the ruins of Paradise, the president got his own clear view of just how devastating this fire was. And he offered his sympathy to the people of this town and the families of those still missing.
This is very sad to see it. As far as the lives are concerned, nobody knows quite yet. We're up to a certain number, but we have a lot of people that aren't accounted for. And this is the kind of destruction. In fact, they're telling me this is even not as bad as some areas. Some areas are even beyond this. They're just charred.
A week ago, while this earth was still hot, the president sparked a debate about forest management. He'd threatened to cut government funding, but after the anger of his initial reaction, today he met some of those who responded and have been searching what's left. He was asked if any of this made him think differently about climate change.
No. I have a strong opinion. I want great climate. We're going to have that, and we're going to have forests that are very safe.
The president has shown Paradise, like so many other places, that his words can be divisive and controversial before they're unifying and supportive. But his message here today is that he stands with the people here. Meanwhile, they stand in line to fill in the forms for federal government help. People need to re-establish their identity before they can rebuild their lives. And not all gave the president a welcome.
And he's saying that, that the forests have been mismanaged. Well, it's federal. It's the Bureau of Land Management. It's taken care of by the feds.
He doesn't understand California. He doesn't appreciate California. He doesn't like California. He thinks that we should have cut down all our trees and not let any water go into the Pacific Ocean. And I just don't agree with him on a lot of those things.
Paradise must be seen to be believed. The president's viewed a fraction of what's been lost here, but the full extent of the destruction and what caused it is still being revealed.
Dan Johnson there reporting from Paradise. Now let's get to some of the day's other news. The US State Department says it has not reached a final conclusion on who was involved in the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi amid media reports that the CIA believes Crown Prince Mohammed ordered the killing. President Trump says he will talk to CIA chiefs following the reports. Saudi Arabia has called the claim false. A war crime suspect in the Central African Republic has been detained and handed over to a tribunal in the Netherlands. Alfred Yekatom, who was once nicknamed Rambo, led a Christian militia in the anti-Balaka movement. It's accused of murdering and torturing members of the CAR's Muslim community between 2013 and 2014. Protesters have blocked off 5 major bridges in central London, demanding that the UK government takes greater action on climate change. It followed a week of action by the campaign group Extinction Rebellion. The group said 6,000 people had joined the demonstrations and there'd been 45 arrests. Police in Athens have used tear gas and stun grenades against anarchists who threw firebombs on the 45th anniversary of a student revolt. Hooded youths put up barricades in the Greek capital, where a former military government killed 24 people during student protests in 1973. Democrat Andrew Gillum has conceded defeat to Republican Ron DeSantis in Florida's governor race as a recount of ballots neared its end. The Democrat congratulated Republican former Congressman Ron DeSantis on becoming the state's next governor. Now, more than 250,000 people have taken part in demonstrations across France against high fuel prices and the rising cost of living. One person was killed in an accident when a motorist tried to drive through a blockade, and more than 200 others have been injured. Lucy Williamson reports from Paris.
There are those in France who say they feel invisible to their leaders. Not today. High visibility jackets, the new uniform of a leaderless nationwide movement, blocking roads across the country in protest at rising fuel taxes and the rising cost of living.
I am a nurse and I'm tired of being so heavily taxed.
The little people are fed up with it, and that's why they've come out today.
Anger meant for the government spilled out at some sites. One protester was killed. And among more than 200 people injured, this policeman who simply got in the way. Priscilla Ludowski's petition against the price rises helped spark this movement. She gathered 800,000 signatures, but got no response from the government.
We're not listened to, we're not understood, we're not even consulted on big decisions. We see the president talking to people on the street, but the government is not at all connected to reality.
The government this week announced 500 million euros of energy aid for poorer households, but many here feel that business and industry should be paying more. Emmanuel Macron, no friend of the struggling, but president of the rich, according to some.
President Macron came to power promising to heal the rift between voters and their leaders. His campaign image based on a new kind of grassroots democracy. But across the country today, protesters are accusing him of continuing France's economic divisions and the distrust that many still feel towards their politicians. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
You can get more on those French protests and all of the stories on our website. There's lots of background and analysis from our correspondents, bbc.com/news. Well, let's get more now on events in California, where President Trump has met emergency teams fighting wildfires. Our correspondent Dave Lee is in Chico with more on the rescue and recovery operation.
It's now more than a week on since the huge wildfire devastated the town of Paradise, and there are still many hundreds of people unaccounted for. Those who did make it out are still in places like this. This is an unofficial area for those who fled the fire and didn't have anywhere else to go. Gradually, we're expecting this place to thin out as people are being offered free bus rides and free ride shares to get to a proper shelter around an hour or so's drive from where we are. When they get there, they're going to be greeted with proper supplies, a place to sleep, but also help for the next steps, getting the financial support to try and move on from what has happened to them here. President Trump has been in the area surveying the damage for himself and also offering his support to the firefighters that are still tackling this blaze up in the hills here. He removed his threats, or rescinded his threats, to take away federal funding from California because of bad forest management. He now says that funding will be made available and that he and Governor Jerry Brown will work together to solve this problem for California. As for the people that are here, what you can see perhaps behind me is the first blue sky since the fires happened. Dave Lee, BBC News in Chico.
Well, we can actually speak to Brandon Wilson, whose home near Malibu was destroyed by the fires, and he joins us now from the coastal town of Del Mar near San Diego. Thank you so much for joining us, Brandon. We're so sorry to hear about your home. What was that experience like, finding out what had happened to your home?
Well, we got run off the mountain and, pretty much and just we grabbed the animals, and the fire came up so quick that we had to leave the ranch, and we just, loaded up the dogs and ran down. And by the time we got down, the fire had pretty much come across Mulholland and engulfed the ranch behind us. It was pretty fast, and it moved quicker than, we expected. It was out of a kind of a bad movie.
So did you know as you were evacuating that your home was in peril?
We knew, yeah, we knew right away. We got chased off the mountain by the fire, we had an idea. We didn't know if it was going to come back, and then we went and looked back at the house, and the only thing that was left was a 1930s chimney and the propane tank. So it was it engulfed everything on the ranch, the two houses, and the entire setup there pretty quickly.
There are a lot of people who are experiencing what you're experiencing and having to be evacuated and not able to go back to homes they've lost. How has your experience been of authorities helping people such as yourself?
Well, it's just all devastating. You know, when it hits everybody, it's just been a rough ride. No one expects it. And when it happens, I think everybody, you know, doesn't realize how quick it comes. And when it does, it kind of a lot of emotions and trauma hit. At the same time, people come together and try to help each other out. And it's an overwhelming emotion to lose all your belongings and things at the same time while everybody's getting engulfed by flames quicker than you can expect. So as you can see, it's a lot to deal with. And, you know, it's nice to see people come together and help during the fires and see, you know, make sure that, you know, everybody's to safety. And I think Malibu came together in a way that, you know, was monumental for the community to hang on to what we had and see what we could do. And there's a lot of famous people's homes, and Gerard Butler to many others that were taken by the fire. And I think that, you know, with the kind of community we have, it's nice to see people come together and help each other.
And how have you been coping in terms of making sure you've got food and shelter and things like that?
Well, you know, when we got out pretty quick, and I know that others that came through they had boats and jet skis and other things that showed up with water and supplies, and, you know, PCH was cut off. The Pacific Coast Highway was cut off by the Highway Patrol. So they had emergency services come in, and I saw a lot of people coming in by boat and dropping things off to people that were still there and stranded, because from Pepperdine on up all the way up to Ventura was pretty much taken out by the fires, and especially up in the canyons and where we were in Mulholland and in Cane and Doom, which was just Calamigos Ranch is right there, and Malibu Safari Ranch is right there, the Wine Safari, and they have a giant giraffe there and animals, exotic animals that I know that they had a tough time getting those out of there, and the horses are running wild on the streets, and, you know, it was chaotic. At the same time, they got the animals out pretty safely, and they ran them to the beach, a lot of them, and they got the giraffe out finally, George, who was, you know, kind of a famous giraffe from that movie Hangover.
Now, today people have been talking about the US President Donald Trump's visit as well to some of the fire-affected region, and obviously he's had some controversial things to say. What's your feeling on President Trump's visit?
Well, I think his first initial comments weren't sensitive enough to the community at the time, and if he wants to make changes, I think he should wait till an appropriate time after people can process the fire and get through it and recoup and come back. And then we'll come back and talk about his issues. And now he's saying stuff after the fact. But, you know, if he comes in and helps now and later on make the changes. But I think right now is not the time to make comments when people's lives have been destroyed and trying to rebuild. I think that's kind of where I think that the California people stand. And I think that's a lot of people think that.
In terms of people rebuilding their lives, I wonder, what are your long-term plans? Do you plan to go back to Malibu?
Yeah, we're going to go back to Malibu. We're going to rebuild, obviously go through the insurance policy and see what can be done. And then, you know, just see, you know, I think you come back and you start over again. You make it better than it was before. And you try to just rehash, you know, anything that's left. And hopefully, you know, just come back. And that's all you can really do.
Well, Brandon Wilson, we very much wish you well, and we're so grateful that you had time to talk to us this evening. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Now, in other news, a senior member of Theresa May's cabinet has called for changes to her Brexit plans. Andrea Leadsom, who's the leader of the Commons, said there was potential to improve a draft deal before the Prime Minister presents it to European leaders next week. Mrs Leadsom is among 5 Brexit-supporting cabinet ministers said to be demanding significant changes. However, alterations to the draft have been described as a fantasy by another government minister. Mrs May has been speaking to local Conservative Party members as she seeks to head off a possible vote of no confidence. This report from our political correspondent Ian Watson contains some flash photography.
Even in an era of political turmoil, the events of the past few days have been remarkable.
This is a decisive step which enables us to move on and finalise the deal in the days ahead.
On Wednesday, Theresa May announced she had the backing of her top team for a deal with the EU.
There's no deal, just a bluff.
But by Thursday, there were 2 cabinet resignations, including the loss of her second Brexit secretary, and the Prime Minister's own position was under threat when this leading Leave campaigner called for her to stand down.
What we need is a leader who will say to the European Union, it is impossible to divide up the United Kingdom.
Then another blow. Some who said they supported the Prime Minister began to attach strings. And today, just listen to this Cabinet Minister talking about the EU deal.
You know, I think, as I've said on a number of occasions, I think that the UK cannot be trapped in a permanent customs arrangement, and I think that it's really important that we get some sort of clarity and some improvement on that particular aspect of it.
So who really is running the government? Michael Gove and 3 other Brexiteer cabinet ministers are joining Andrea Leadsom in calling for further changes to the Prime Minister's deal, though not yet for a change of Prime Minister.
I'm totally supportive of the Prime Minister. I think she's doing a fantastic job.
Though he could still be gearing up for some arguments behind closed doors. The EU aren't keen to unpick a 585-page withdrawal agreement, and some ministers believe it's unreasonable to ask.
Just because some cabinet ministers make demands of the Prime Minister that the details are going to change is, I think, fantasy.
But without any changes, this MP who voted to leave believes the Prime Minister may be ousted and her deal will definitely be defeated.
Over the weeks to come, people are going to see that the deal that the European Union have offered us, and which Theresa May said is the best deal she's been able to secure, is simply infinitely worse than the option of moving to a clean global Brexit.
So tonight the Prime Minister is fighting both for her deal and for her leadership.
This is BBC News, the headlines. President Trump has visited Paradise, the US town in California worst affected by the recent wildfires. He praised the efforts of the local police and the teams searching for survivors. More than 250,000 people have taken to the streets of France to protest at rising fuel prices. Now, Argentina's government says it does not have the means to retrieve a submarine that's just been found at the bottom of the Atlantic a year after it went missing with 44 crew members on board. The submarine disappeared in November last year after reporting an electrical fault, and the government will declare 2 days of mourning for the victims. Nicola Carroll reports.
366 days since the ARA San Juan submarine went missing with 44 crew on board, and finally an announcement from the authorities.
The submarine is located in a deep place at a depth of 870 metres, and there is a dip to 907 metres, which is where the submarine is. That dip hit the submarine from the sonars.
At a news conference, the Defence Ministry said that it seemed impossible to recover what was left of the submarine.
We also don't have a remotely operated vehicle to go down to those depths to check the seabed, and we don't have the equipment to extract a vessel with those characteristics.
News that the vessel had been found 800 metres below the surface of the ocean offered little comfort to the families of the dead. The San Juan was returning from a routine mission to Ushuaia, around 400 kilometres off the Patagonian coast, when it reported an electrical breakdown on November the 15th, 2017. A massive international search and rescue operation found no trace of the missing sub, and hope of finding survivors was abandoned after 2 weeks. For a year, nothing. The failed search raised questions over the state of the Argentinian Armada, which was one of Latin America's smallest defence budgets relative to the size of its economy. At the one-year commemoration held on Thursday, relatives were still asking questions.
I do not wish the loss of a child on anyone, not my worst enemy. We want to have news. We want justice to be done, for the truth to be known, and for the guilty to pay.
A day later, relatives received the news that the vessel had been found. It had been located by a private company hired by the government. The question now is whether the vessel can actually be retrieved. Nicola Carroll, BBC News.
Reports from eastern Congo say efforts to contain a deadly outbreak of the Ebola virus have been suspended after factional fighting in the eastern town of Beni spread to aid workers' compounds. The World Health Organization says it's evacuating 16 staff members after a shell hit the building they were staying in. At least 7 peacekeepers were killed earlier in the week. Now, tensions over trade and China's growing influence in the Pacific have overshadowed the final day of the APEC summit in Papua New Guinea. In a veiled reference to the US's trade war against China, Chinese President Xi Jinping warned against countries pursuing a path of unilateralism and protectionism. He and 20 other world leaders are due to attend a closing ceremony in the capital Port Moresby in a few hours' time. And more strikes are affecting 2 of the country's biggest rail operators. Workers at South Western Railway and at Northern are taking industrial action in the continuing dispute over the role of guards on trains. Northern says just 30% of its services have been running today. Another former BBC newsreader, Richard Baker, has died. He was 93 and introduced the corporation's first ever television news bulletin in 1954. David Sillito looks back at his life.
1954, and the first ever BBC television news bulletin began with the voice of Richard Baker.
Here is an illustrated summary of the news. It'll be followed by the latest film of events and happenings at home and abroad.
In those early days, newsreaders were never seen because it was feared that our facial expressions might not always look impartial, and worse still, that we might turn the news into a personality performance.
Richard Baker, for more than a quarter of a century, he helped define the calm, clear voice of BBC TV News.
Police reinforcements are drafted into Downing Street tonight as the crowd outside number 10 built up to about 300. Good evening, and first the big fire at a...
He was a presenter rather than a journalist, but this veteran of the wartime Arctic convoys was also a writer. His great love, music. A panellist on Face the Music, he presented radio programmes, and for many years he was the TV face of the proms.
Good evening to you and a very warm welcome to the Royal Albert Hall.
In his spare time, he had to go at acting, here with Prince Edward.
Forgot you, sir? Oh, notorious villain!
And there was also a memorable moment on Morecambe and Wise. He was still broadcasting into his 80s, but he'll always be remembered as the voice and then as one of the best-known faces of BBC News.
For the moment, that's all the news, except for a word about the weather.
Great memories there. Now, often cheaper than a bottle of water, energy drinks can be very popular with children, but doctors say there should be a ban on selling them to anyone under the age of 16. A consultation on that proposal runs until Tuesday of next week, as Hayley Hassel reports.
So who here has had a sip or drank an energy drink?
I'll have energy drinks about once every couple of weeks. I had the energy drink when my sister had one. I only had a sip and it still made me hyper.
I have an energy drink on a Saturday when I go dancing because it wakes me up really early. I like the taste of it, but then later on I just didn't like how I felt.
Well done, OK.
According to the Department of Health, 2/3 of 10 to 17-year-olds are regular consumers of energy drinks. The average energy drink contains 15 cubes of sugar and 150 milligrams of caffeine. That's the equivalent to 2 strong cups of coffee. And the World Health Organization warns that drinking these often could lead to problems with high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, poor dental health and obesity.
Children are particularly susceptible to the advertising. Their bodies aren't equipped to consume that amount of caffeine. The sugar content can increase the risk of childhood obesity, the oral health implications. We've got children having dental extractions of their adult teeth, which impacts upon their speech and their self-esteem. So from a public health perspective, we'd be very keen to see the energy drinks being banned for under the age of 18, and we would like to see that happen as soon as possible.
I was drinking like 3-4 energy drinks a day.
From being 12 years old, James drank more than 3 cans of energy drinks a day. Then last year he collapsed and had to have his gallbladder removed.
I drank them because I was like tired and it'd give us like a quick energy boost, but then I'd feel tired again, so then I'd drink like another one. I just thought like I had a problem with my stomach. I used to pass out. I passed out a few times, used to pass out in school, and then went to the doctors. Eventually got like an ultrasound, and then they said it was gallstones.
That must have felt awful for you. Had you any idea that what was causing the problem?
Well, I ended up in hospital and had my gallbladder removed, and they said it could have been because I was drinking energy drinks.
At the time, did you know that energy drinks weren't suitable for kids?
I didn't know that they weren't suitable for children, but I know they got a label on the back, but who reads that?
Now it's a year since his operation, and he's a different character. But back in year 9, he was a handful, and now in year 11, he's a different person.
Thousands of people have got behind a campaign to stop energy drinks being sold to children, and some supermarkets have already voluntarily stopped selling them. When the government launched the consultation, the drinks industry said that a sales ban on energy drinks is not effective, as there are much greater contributors of caffeine and sugar in our diets. Now, as you can see, the energy drinks are on the same shelves as the fizzy pop and the juice. They've got bright coloured cans, and they usually cost a lot less than the others as well. They're on average 99p here and over £1 for the other drinks. Now, there are warning signs on the back that say they do have a high level of caffeine and they're not suitable for children. But campaigners want the government to go one step further, and they want to ban children from being able to buy them completely. Hayley Hassel, BBC News.
Much more coming up, but you can reach me on Twitter. I'm at Regid Ahmed BBC. Now the weather with Chris Fawkes.
Hello there. The second half of the weekend is looking fine and sunny for most areas of the UK, with quite a chilly wind out and about. Now, yesterday we had some sparkling visibility, clear blue skies across the Highlands of Scotland. We had a number of beautiful Weather Watch pictures sent in to us. But you know what? Our weather patterns are all interlinked, and what happens to the northwest of us, near the Arctic Circle, North Iceland, we had temperatures up to 17 degrees Celsius, which is just astonishing. That's 14 degrees above normal, and it's set in place a chain reaction. That warm air is going to go into the Arctic, and the Arctic responds by chucking a load of cold air out across northern Europe. That ultimately is heading to our shores over the next couple of days. So a change in the weather is just around the corner. But before we get there, it's going to be a chilly start to the day this morning, because we've had these clear skies for most of the night, and that's allowed temperatures to plunge. Because the breeze has stayed up, there's not too much frost out and about, but temperatures in the towns and cities have got down into low single figures. And in some of the deeper valleys, for example, in the Highlands of Scotland, the Grampians too, well, there are a few patches of frost where the winds have just managed to fall light. Here's a weather chart then through the rest of the day today. High pressure still influencing our weather, still dragging the dry air in from Europe, and that's significant because that's why we're not seeing much in the way of cloud. That said, there may well be some patches of cloud through the Vale of York and eastern areas of Scotland to start the day. Through time, these will probably thin and break up to give some sunshine, and a much sunnier day coming up for Northern Ireland compared with Saturday. In fact, for most of us, it is going to be fine, settled and sunny, but there will be that chilly breeze blowing throughout the day. Temperatures actually near normal for the time of year, ranging from around 10 to 12 degrees, but perhaps feeling a little on the cool side around the coastline of East Anglia, southern parts of England as well. Now, we start to see those changes taking place with the weather as we look at the charts for Monday. Certainly a lot more cloud moving in, and that cloud will be thick enough to bring some outbreaks of light rain or drizzle around some of the western coasts of Scotland, western areas of England. A lot of cloud around, cool winds, and temperatures just starting to edge down a little bit, but the really cold air doesn't arrive until we get on into Tuesday, and it's really focused across England and Wales, where temperatures really will be struggling. 6 degrees or so in London, and notice we still have some spots of blue on the charts. There will be some rain and drizzle across England and Wales. A cool down in the weather for Scotland and Northern Ireland, but the coldest air will be that bit further southwards.
So here's the outlook. Not a bad kind of day for today, but it's a downward spiral with temperatures. And as we look at the charts into the middle part of the week, look at Cardiff, just 5 degrees by Wednesday. Winter is coming.
This is BBC News, the headlines. President Donald Trump has visited California to survey the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in the state's history. He praised the efforts of local police, politicians and the teams searching for survivors. The Camp Fire in Northern California has killed at least 71 people. About 250,000 people have taken part in demonstrations across France against a further increase in fuel tax and the rising cost of living. One demonstrator was killed when a panicking driver drove into protesters. There were more than 100 injuries nationwide. A senior member of the British Prime Minister's cabinet has called for changes to her Brexit plans. Andrea Leadsom, who's the leader of the Commons, said there was potential to improve a draft deal before the Prime Minister presents it to European leaders next week.